No nation tests the United States without paying the price. Those words feel heavier than ever as we take you into what happened at 2:15 a.m. on November 3rd, when the dark sky over Caracas suddenly turned into a wall of fire. The first blast rose from La Carlota Air Base, followed seconds later by a second eruption near the military hangars in Maiquetía. A group of elite Venezuelan pilots had just made the most dangerous choice of their lives. Instead of following orders that targeted their own people, they destroyed the regime's Su-30 fighters and the transport planes meant for Maduro's escape. Inside the bases, alarms echoed and loyalist forces scrambled, firing into the night as the rebels crossed only 50 yards of open ground to reach the hangars. This was not chaos. It was a calculated strike meant to break the strongest shield of the regime. What the loyalists did not know was that they had just triggered a fight that would reach far beyond Venezuela's borders. If you want to follow this rebellion as it unfolds, hit subscribe and stay with us. What happened that night matters far beyond the explosions. La Carlota and the military zone in Maiquetía are not random places. They are the heart of Venezuela's air power, the two locations the regime relies on to control the capital, move troops, and secure any escape route if the country collapses. By hitting both sites at the same time, the rebel pilots didn't just destroy jets. They cut into the one thing the Maduro government believed it could still trust. The Su-30 fighters are the most advanced aircraft in the country, and the C-130 transport planes are the only machines able to carry officials, families, and bags of cash across borders in minutes. Losing them changes everything. For the regime, this strike is more than a military loss. It is a message written in flames that even their closest forces are done taking illegal orders. For regular Venezuelans, the ones who live with blackouts, shortages, and fear, the explosions meant something different. It meant someone inside the system finally stood up for them. People in several neighborhoods banged pots from balconies as the fires burned. A sound that has become a quiet form of protest when speaking out can get you arrested. Strategically, the danger is even bigger. When the most loyal branch of the military cracks, the whole structure begins to wobble. Infantry units working long hours for low pay watch this and wonder what comes next. Maduro knows this, and that is why the regime rushed to shut down the internet, impose curfews, and send patrols into opposition areas. But each move only shows how fragile his control now is. And around the region, the impact spreads fast. Colombia and Brazil tightened border security, while the European Union urged a return to constitutional order. Russia and China called for no interference, but even they understand the threat a fractured Venezuelan military creates. What began as a nighttime sabotage now stands as the moment that could shift the balance of power across the entire northern edge of South America. The pilots may have destroyed metal, but they also broke the illusion that the regime was untouchable. The first shock of the rebellion hit La Carlota with force. As the first Su-30 burned, alarms echoed across the base and loyalist guards rushed through smoke trying to understand what was happening. Radar operators watched their screens fill with heat spikes where parked aircraft should have been. One later said it looked like the base was on fire from the inside. On the ground, the rebel team pushed fast. They had minutes before loyalist forces regrouped. A pilot crawled past broken lights toward the jet he once flew. He set a thermal charge in the cockpit and felt the blast behind him as he moved away. For him, destroying the jet meant blocking the regime's escape and stopping an order aimed at civilians. At the same time, in Maiquetía, loyalist guards ran toward the transport hangars after receiving a fake report about urgent cargo. By the time they realized it was a trap, the rebels had punctured the C-130's tires, drained its fuel, and smashed its navigation screens. A young controller helping them said he watched the loyalists freeze as they understood their escape aircraft were now dead. Back at La Carlota, gunfire grew heavier. Loyalist units fired into the dark while rebels moved from hangar to hangar placing the last charges. The sound barely stopped, yet at moments everything fell silent except the wind, and both sides waited for the next shot, unsure who held the advantage. When the final Su-30 lit up, the glow covered half the base. Loyalist commanders shouted to regroup, but the rebels were already pulling back through planned exit points. A masked pilot recorded a video that reached Washington minutes later. Pentagon analysts confirmed the uniforms and aircraft. It was real, and it meant Venezuela had entered a new phase. As the reports reached the White House, officials prepared satellite passes and emergency communication channels. The next hours would decide if this was a short mutiny or the start of something larger. Now, the question sits with you. If you think the rebels acted for the people, press 1. If you believe the loyalists will regain control, press 9. Stay with us as the crisis grows. As the night went on, the fighting inside both bases intensified. What started as fast sabotage had become a real battle. At La Carlota, loyalist commanders pushed armored trucks toward the burning hangars while smoke covered the runway. The rebels knew they could not hold the base, so they moved in short bursts, using darkness and debris to stay ahead. In close quarters, even a small turn can decide who gets hit first, and both sides fought without knowing who had control. Colectivos arrived next, firing wildly as they tried to trap the rebels. Their inaccurate bursts made the scene even more chaotic. Small charges set by the rebels slowed them just enough to keep the escape route open, and each explosion added another layer of confusion that hid the rebels' movements. In Maiquetía, loyalists tried to save the damaged transport planes. Mechanics rushed toward the C-130, but fuel lines were cut and cockpit systems smashed. Tow orders were useless with blown tires and dead controls. Smoke rising from La Carlota told loyalist officers their air network was collapsing from both ends, and several units hesitated, unsure which orders were still reliable. Inside the control tower, rebel sympathizers listened to radio calls. Loyalist units asked for helicopters, but most aircraft couldn't lift through the thick smoke. The rebels had expected this. Without air support, loyalists were stuck on foot and unsure how many rebels remained inside. A brief silence fell across the base, broken only by alarms and the sound of fire. Then loyalists pushed again, firing into doorways and windows, but each advance triggered another blast from sabotage jets or fuel lines. Fatigue hit quickly. They could barely see, barely coordinate, and feared another charge hidden ahead. Reaching the outer edge of La Carlota, the rebels set one last diversion. A blast near the fuel yard drew loyalist forces to the wrong side. That opening let the rebels slip through a service gate and disappear into the dark streets where safe routes waited. By the time loyalist forces regained control, the damage was done. Key jets destroyed, transport planes disabled, and morale shaken across the Air Force. But the real danger for the regime was not the wreckage, it was the growing doubt inside their own ranks. If you think more soldiers will switch sides, press 1. If you believe the regime can still hold on, press 9. Just when loyalist commanders thought the chaos was ending, a new twist changed the entire picture. Pentagon analysts confirmed that several small aircraft vanished near the Colombian border shortly after the fires began. At first, loyalist units assumed they were destroyed, but satellite images showed they had taken off from small rural airstrips and slipped into dark air corridors almost never patrolled at night. This meant the uprising wasn't limited to the bases. A second group of pilots used the confusion to escape with flight logs, internal orders, and data showing how the regime planned to use the Air Force against civilians. Losing that information was a blow far more dangerous than losing aircraft. Inside Caracas, security forces launched raids but had no clear idea who had fled, who was hiding, or who was quietly helping the rebels. That uncertainty spread through the ranks. Some loyalist units hesitated to follow orders. Others whispered that the rebellion was larger than anyone thought. Across the border, rebel contacts reported that at least one missing aircraft reached a safe zone. Washington gave no official comment, but the silence suggested the pilots were now under protection. For Maduro, the real threat wasn't the burned jets, it was the possibility that his own pilots were cooperating with foreign intelligence. By dawn, the twist was clear. The rebellion was layered, planned, and aimed at breaking the regime from inside. If you think this twist will push more officers to defect, press 1. If you believe the regime can still seal the leaks, press 9. As dawn rose over Caracas, the full scale of the crisis finally appeared. Smoke drifted over La Carlota, revealing burned Su-30 fighters scattered across the runway. Loyalist soldiers stepped through the debris quietly, staring at the twisted metal that only hours earlier represented the regime's strongest weapon. These jets had been used to control the capital. Now they were nothing but wreckage. Above the city, US reconnaissance aircraft and satellites swept across Venezuela. Analysts tracked heat signatures, damaged aircraft, and scattered troop movements. The patterns made one thing clear: the Air Force was no longer united. Some units tried to regroup while others froze, unsure if obeying orders would lead them into danger. At Myketia, Loyalist mechanics worked to revive one transport plane, but every system was gone. Fuel lines were cut, tires destroyed, and cockpit controls smashed beyond repair. Officers realized the escape route they believed they could rely on had collapsed completely. Inside government command rooms, Maduro's advisors argued. Some demanded quick arrests. Others warned that forcing loyalty could push even more pilots to defect. The tension grew when reports arrived that several pilots inside the bases refused new commands unless their families were protected. For a branch once seen as loyal, this was a disastrous shift. Then, a sudden explosion echoed inside La Carlota. It wasn't large, but it sent soldiers diving for cover. Fear of hidden charges forced Loyalist units to retreat again, leaving parts of the base unsecured. The rebel sabotage had turned the facility into a maze of risk. US satellites detected strange activity at smaller airstrips. Some aircraft looked abandoned, others repositioned with no crews nearby. Nothing was coordinated. The Air Force was splitting into pockets of loyalty, panic, and silent resistance. By late morning, Loyalist forces finally sealed the perimeters, but the damage was done. The regime had lost its strongest fighters, its transport planes, and most damaging of all, the trust of its own pilots. Images of the burning jets spread worldwide, and analysts warned that Venezuela's air defenses had taken a historic hit. For the first time in years, the regime faced a threat it could not control, a rebellion rising from inside the ranks it depended on most. By the afternoon, the crisis had spilled far beyond the bases. Across Caracas, people gathered on balconies, banging pots and cheering as news of the destroyed jets spread online through VPNs and private messages. For many Venezuelans, the sight of flames over La Carlota was the first sign in years that someone inside the military was willing to stand against the regime. Even neighborhoods, long silenced by fear, now echoed with small but powerful acts of support. Economically, the impact hit almost instantly. The bolivar crashed to new lows on the open market, and analysts warned that the sudden collapse of the Air Force would shake foreign investors and oil shipments. A brief spike in global oil prices showed how worried the region had become. Colombia and Brazil increased border security, unsure if more pilots or soldiers would flee in the coming days. The European Union called for calm, while Russia and China repeated their usual line about non-interference, even as they watched the situation closely. Inside the Venezuelan military, the psychological effect was even deeper. Pilots who had stayed silent for years now questioned whether the regime could protect them or their families. Infantry units working long hours for low pay wondered what would happen if the rebellion spread. The destruction of the Su-32nd didn't just weaken the regime's defense, it broke the belief that the Air Force would always stand with Maduro. In Washington, officials monitored satellite feeds and intelligence reports, preparing for every possible outcome. Specialists noted that the rebellion had hit the one branch of the military the regime relied on most. With the Air Force fractured, the government no longer had a clear escape route, nor the air power to intimidate rivals. One official described the moment as a turning point that will shape the next phase of the crisis. International observers warned that the next days would be critical. If more pilots or officers defected, the regime could face a complete internal collapse. If loyalists regained control, the crackdown might be severe. Everything depended on the choices made in the shadows, choices no one outside the bases could fully see. Now the question turns to you. If you believe this moment marks the beginning of the regime's fall, press 1. If you think loyalist forces can pull the country back under control, press 9. Stay with us as the story moves into its next phase.